One of the greatest mistakes that the American government makes in declaring the war is the way they go about informing their own army that war has been declared, particularly in the Northwest. They make the mistake of sending word out by the common post, which could take weeks, even months. The British commanders in the Northwest know that war has been declared before the American commanders do.
At the western edge of the United States, the American fort on Mackinac Island, commanded by Lieutenant Porter Hanks, controlled the strategic narrows between Lakes Michigan and Huron. One peaceful day in July 1812, a British and Indian force gathered on the heights behind the fort and sent over a messenger.
Lieutenant Porter Hanks is completely unaware that war has been declared until, this is oversimplifying to a point, but he wakes up one morning, there's a cannon pointing down the hill and a guy in a red coat knocking on the door saying, we'd like the keys.
Lieutenant Hanks surrendered to the British, and minutes later, the Union Jack flew over the fort.
A fort of this magnitude has simply fallen without a fight. This is a tremendous blow to American morale, to the strategic situation in the Northwest.
In the summer of 1812, James Madison approved a plan that surprised no one. The United States would wage war on Britain by invading Canada. The Americans would invade in 3 places. One army would plow into Canada from Detroit at the western edge of Lake Erie. Another force would cross the border at the Niagara River, just east of Lake Erie, and a third would head directly for Montreal.
The U.S. plan at the beginning of the war, it's that they were planning to attack everywhere, it seems. And it was all very disorganized.
The U.S. plan ignored some basic truths of the era. There were no real roads. Transportation moved well only on water, and the British held the St. Lawrence. Towns on the distant frontier were out of touch with Washington, and communication between the 3 American armies was non-existent.
At the same time, the British, who had very much smaller forces in Canada, the planning was very good, the defense planning. They knew what they wanted to do.
And they knew who they wanted to do it. The fate of the Canadian colonies rested in the hands of Governor-General Sir George Prevost, a sensible, practical administrator. His job was to hold on to as much of Canada as he could.
He faced a big challenge, large territory, sparse population, and a territory that wasn't all that well fortified.
But Prevost had an asset in the brilliant General Isaac Brock, commander in Upper Canada. Brock was Prevost's antithesis. He was 42, strikingly handsome, a wine lover and gourmet, a dazzling dancer, an omnivorous reader, an aggressive, willful gambler, an aristocrat to his bones.
He was extremely energetic. He was extremely ambitious. He did not want to be in Canada. He knew the real war was in Europe, and he felt that if he distinguished himself here, that they would send him over to Europe, to where the real war was.
When he first joined the 49th Regiment of Foot, in the regiment was a famous duelist. This man insulted Brock. Brock insulted him right back. So this man challenged Brock to a duel. Brock chose pistols to be fired over a handkerchief, not a distance of 30 paces, but over the width of a handkerchief. The duelist backed down, and being disgraced had to leave the regiment.
In North America, Brock and Prevost realized that Upper Canada, the vast province in the west bordering all 5 of the Great Lakes, might be lost to the invading Americans.
Isaac Brock, my situation is most critical. Most of the people have lost all confidence. I, however, speak loud and look big.
Looking big might not be enough. Brock had a massive area to defend and few men to do it with. Beyond the Canadian militia, he had just 1,200 regular soldiers from the British Army. But it was an army of veterans.
It was an army made up basically of the poor. The soldiers were there out of economic desperation by and large.
They joined the army for the food, the lodging, and the clothes on their back, because it beat the devil out of starving to death in the slums of Glasgow.
One British soldier was Shadrach Byfield, a young man from Wiltshire, a weaver by trade.
Shadrach Byfield. I entered the military service at 18 in the year 1807. My mother, on hearing I was enlisting, was so affected she fell in a fit and never spoke after. I was obliged to march off the next morning.
The man who understood British soldiers best, the Duke of Wellington, said that they were the scum of the earth, enlisted for drink. He also said that he put his life in their hands, so they were at one and the same time at the bottom end of the socio-economic scale, and they were hugely important. These guys are professionals.
The U.S. Army, by contrast, had virtually no professionals. Americans still distrusted the entire idea of a standing army, which might become a threat to their liberty. So the United States would rely heavily on militia.
Many of the militia during this period regarded their training on a monthly basis as an opportunity to get together with friends, discuss what's going on, and then adjourn to the local tavern to end up the day with a few drinks.
American militia service was an oddly informal arrangement. They often had no uniforms. They often elected their own officers. Their attachment to their home state was as powerful as their feelings for the country, and few imagined that invading another nation might be part of the job description. The American generals Madison had to choose from were hardly better. In fact, they were worse.
The generals he had to pick among were either very young and untried or veterans who were 30 years past their prime. He went with the veterans and it was disastrous.
One such veteran was William Hull.
William Hull had been a brave soldier in the Revolution. He was 58. He had eaten and drunk a great deal too well for 30 years. And when the war was looming, Madison called him back to Washington and offered him a generalship in the fledgling American Army. They needed him to go and invade Canada. So he went off with many misgivings and no possibility of success.
In July 1812, General Hull assembled an army for what looked to be an invincible invasion sent from Detroit. General Brock had only one hope to stop the American invasion: help from the native warriors.
We are committed to a war in which the enemy will always surpass us in numbers, equipment, and resources. It is of primary importance that the confidence and goodwill of the Indians be preserved.
During the American Revolution, most Native Americans had allied themselves with the British, a decision that cost them lives and land.
The British understood that without Native allies, they would have a very difficult time. But because of our losses during the Revolutionary War, our people were very hesitant to fight. When we put ourselves in the moccasins of these fellows back then, what big decisions ahead? What side to pick? What fight to make? And where to make that fight? They're big, big decisions.
But after the burning of Prophetstown, Tecumseh had made his choice. Late one August evening, he entered Brock's quarters on the Canadian side of the Detroit River. The two men liked each other on sight.
A more sagacious and gallant warrior does not, I believe, exist. Tecumseh has the admiration of everyone who conversed with him.
They've both been professional, full-time soldiers, basically, in their culture since they've been teenagers. Isaac Brock's older brother had been killed during the American Revolution as a British officer. And Tecumseh's older brother had been killed, and his father as well, fighting Americans.
All of Brock's officers urged caution. Tecumseh pushed for an immediate attack. Brock agreed. "This is a man," Tecumseh said of Brock. On the morning of August 15th, 1812, they crossed the river and took up positions around Fort Detroit. The Americans sat safely behind walls 11 feet high, but the audacious Brock sent General Hull a demand. "I require," he wrote, "your immediate surrender." Hull was tortured by doubt.
He had an inordinate fear of the Indians. He was convinced that the Indians were savages beyond any recognition as human beings, that if they were unleashed on his family or his troops, it would be the worst kind of massacre.
Brock dressed Canadian militiamen in surplus uniforms, so they looked like regulars. Tecumseh marched his same men past the fort 3 times, so it looked as if he had thousands of warriors. Then the British primed the cannon.
The British gave notice that they would commence a bombardment of Detroit. When it began, Lydia Bacon, who was the wife of an American Army officer, was actually in the fort. She was in the hospital quarters with other women preparing bandages for the wounded. The British got the range of the fort so well that a shell came through the next door room and killed 2 officers outright.
Lydia Bacon. The cannon began to roar. A 24-pound shot cut 2 officers who were standing in the entry directly in 2. The same ball passed through the wall and took the legs off of 1 man. My feelings were wrought up to a high pitch. But weep I could not, complain I would not.
William Hull did not have Lydia Bacon's courage. The American general disintegrated.
In the fort, there was Hull slumped on the ground, drinking heavily, smoking, tobacco juice and spittle running down the front of his uniform. His men are so angry, they haven't fired a shot.
Hull begged for time. He sent a note to Brock, asking for a 3-day ceasefire.
Shadrach Byfield. I was with General Brock at that time, and from what we could hear, the American general inside the fort wanted 3-day cessation, to which our general replied that if they did not yield in 3 hours, he would blow up every one of them.
Hull didn't need 3 hours. After a few minutes, he ordered a white tablecloth hung out a window. It was the only time in history that a white flag was raised over an American city before a foreign army.
Brock comes, he marches thousands of American troops out, some of them militia he sends home. Hull he takes to Canada, marches him through the streets, and ultimately sends him home.
I have done what my conscience directed, Hull wrote. I have saved Detroit from the horrors of an Indian massacre. But Hull had lost an entire army and had dealt a shocking blow to the morale of his own country.
And Hull's men are pressed to have him court-martialed. And he is found guilty. And he is sentenced to be shot. Madison reviews Hull's record, decides that he was a hero in the Revolution, and he sustains the sentence, but not the execution. And Hull goes home in disgrace to Massachusetts.
But Detroit was only the first of 3 parts to the American invasion of Canada. In October, a second American army assembled in New York at Lewiston, across the Niagara River from the Canadian village of Queenston.
The general that's in command of the region for the American Army is Stephen Van Rensselaer. He's one of the richest men in New York.
Stephen was a fine fellow, an effective politician, a statesman in New York State, but he had no military experience at all.
The British Army, by contrast, was led by Isaac Brock himself. Brock had sailed quickly down Lake Erie to take command of a small army of regulars and irregulars.
And at Queenston Heights, Isaac Brock's got black troops following him. He's got poor Canadian farm kids. And he's also got a couple hundred Grand River warriors. It's this mishmash of people who all come together and fight and defend our version of North America.
Brock's forces were assembled along the heights at Queenston. Yet Van Rensselaer decided to send his army across the Niagara River at Queenston, directly into the British troops.
The Americans had thousands of militia, hundreds of regulars that could have crossed the river, but they only arranged for 13 boats to carry them. Now, the Niagara River is a difficult piece of water to get across, and especially in the middle of the night, and especially when it's rowed by men who haven't been across the Niagara River before.
At dawn on October 13th, 1812, the Americans began to cross as cannon on both sides roared incessantly. A group of Americans reached the shore, then found a fisherman's path up the cliff and took the heights overlooking the town.
Brock knew that if the Americans were able to successfully get a toehold and capture Queenston Heights, there's a good chance that the British would lose Upper Canada.
He leads British soldiers up the hill, dismounted with his sword drawn in full view of the American troops.
An American soldier at about 20 paces away with a double-shotted musket fired at Brock, hit him in the heart and killed him instantly.
The British raised the shout, "Revenge the General!" But the Americans held the high ground, a decisive textbook advantage. But the Grand River Iroquois warriors did not engage in textbook warfare.
Our style of warfare, we like to stick close to cover, keep stealthy and gain the advantage on the enemy. Queenston Heights was basically a flanking maneuver on the native part.
The native warriors worked their way behind the Americans, then burst out of the woods screaming their war cries. One American remembered, "I thought hell had broken loose and led her dogs of war upon us. I expected every moment to be made a cold Yankee."
American militia that are still on the American side of the river can hear the whoops and hollers of the warriors as they're popping in and out of the woods, taking shots and so forth.
Once the militia on the American side heard the war cries of our warriors, they refused to fight on Canadian soil. And they refused to cross to the Canadian side and aid the regulars that were being attacked up on the heights.
The Americans who had crossed the river were doomed. John Beverly Robinson, a British artilleryman, watched them go.
John Beverly Robinson. They had no place to retreat to, and were driven to the brink of the mountain which overhangs the river. Many leaped down the side of the mountain to avoid the horrors which pressed on them, and were dashed in pieces by the fall.
Many died. The rest surrendered, giving the British almost 1,000 prisoners and one of the most momentous victories in the history of Canada. But they had lost one very important man. Isaac Brock, once called the savior of Western Canada, was now gone.
Brock was one of those rare individuals who has a tremendous amount of charisma, a tremendous amount of organizational talent. This is a tremendous blow to Upper Canada. It's a tremendous blow to the British military in that time period.
Yet the British, Canadian, and Native forces had again beaten back an invasion. 2 down, 1 to go. There was a third American army